Mitsubishi self-ejector is playing an important role in various fields, not only in marine circles, but also on land. In order to make the self-ejector fully display its performance and maintain a long time in steady operation, it is necessary to perform periodical maintenance and servicing. In this videotape, we would like to explain about the dismantling and assembling procedures for the operating water supply equipment, vertical shaft, upper bearing housing, horizontal shaft and gear pump of the Mitsubishi self-ejector models SJ3000, 4000, 6000 and model SJ8000, which are the representative models of our purifiers. Before starting the dismantling work, read the instruction manual well and learn in advance the mechanism, inspection points and procedures for the Mitsubishi self-ejector. By this means, accurate and efficient work can be performed. After removing the trap and the bowl, start dismantling the main body of the Mitsubishi self-ejector. For dismantling and assembling the trap and the bowl, please refer to another videotape, Mitsubishi self-ejector dismantling and assembling procedures for the bowl. As for the order of dismantling, first draw out the horizontal shaft parts and then the vertical shaft parts. Remove the gear case cover. Next, remove the frame plug and drain the lubricating oil from the gear case. Remove the motor wiring. At this time, memorize the combination of the letters of the removed wiring. This permits easy wiring after completion of the maintenance work. Applying wiring on the motor's eyebolts, lift up the motor by using a chain hoist, then loosen and remove the set bolts of the motor. Put 2 push bolts into as many holes in the motor flange and take out the motor. Our friction boss is attached to the motor shaft. Moreover, friction blocks are inserted in this friction boss. So be careful not to drop the friction blocks on the floor when drawing out the motor. Next, remove the inlet and outlet pipes connected to the gear pump. Loosen the 6 set bolts fixing the gear pump with a T-type wrench and remove the gear pump. Take off the pump side bearing case. First, remove the 4 bolts fixing the bearing. Draw out the 6 bolts fixing the pump side bearing case. Screw evenly the 2 push bolts set on the pump side bearing case, and then the case is removed. Set two bolts which have already been removed into gear pump fixing holes and remove the pump side bearing case. Now let's go on to the motor side. Take out the friction pulley. First, raise the tooth of the washer of the shaft nut which fixes the friction pulley and loosen and remove the shaft nut with a pin spanner. Set the jack on the friction pulley and go on tightening the jack handle. Then the friction pulley will be separated from the horizontal shaft. Draw out the entire horizontal shaft on the side of the gear pump. If the horizontal shaft is difficult to draw by hand, apply a piece of wood on the pulley side and tap it lightly. Then the shaft can easily be drawn out. At this time, be sure to have another person hold the shaft so as not to drop it on the floor, since the spiral gear might be damaged. Now this completes the removal of the horizontal shaft from the frame. Next, the vertical shaft is drawn out. First, take out the operating water supply equipment. Remove the cap nut of the copper tube. Then remove with a hexagon key the 3 socket cap screws fixing the distributing nozzle. The operating water supply equipment is important for operating the valve cylinder properly. If this equipment becomes scaled or clogged, the prescribed amount of water is not supplied to the pressure water chamber of the bowl, and a defective discharge or no shutting of the valve will occur. As the scaling or clogging of this equipment depends on the properties of the water, it is necessary to check and clean the equipment well in advance. At the same time, the strainers for the operating water line should be cleaned. Next, loosen the 2 square-headed set screws provided on the water chamber cover. Put a push plate on the top of the vertical shaft and set a jack on the water chamber cover. Tighten the jack handle and take out the operating water supply equipment and the bowl bush together. If it is difficult to take them out only by tightening the jack handle, they can easily be drawn out by lightly tapping the head of the jack with a hammer. In this manner, separate the operating water supply equipment from the vertical shaft. Next, draw out the vertical shaft from the frame. Remove the upper cover. Loosen and remove the 3 bolts of the upper bearing housing cover with a T-type wrench. Remove the upper bearing housing cover, the U-type packing, and the plate for upper bearing in that order. Screw evenly 3 push bolts into holes of the upper bearing housing and go on tightening, and then the upper bearing housing can be drawn out and removed from the vertical shaft. Install a lifting tool for the vertical shaft on the threaded part of the top of the vertical shaft and gradually lift up the shaft from the frame by using a chain hoist. Take out 2 steel balls, 2 lower spring receivers and a lower spring which have been incorporated in the lower bearing housing. If it is difficult to take them out, use a magnet. This completes the procedure for removing all the components inside the frame. There is no special order of dismantling the individual drawn-out components. Here we will explain about the dismantling and assembling procedures for the operating water supply equipment, then the vertical shaft, the upper bearing housing, the horizontal shaft, and finally the gear pump. Place the operating water supply equipment on the work table and raise the teeth of 6 tongued washers and loosen and remove the 6 bolts with a box driver. Remove the water chamber cover and set the distributing nozzle on a vise. When a vise is used, be sure to apply soft metal caps to protect the parts. Raise the tooth of the locking washer fixing the operating water disc and loosen the operating water disc retainer with a pin spanner and remove the washer. By removing the water chamber and the operating water disc together, the dismantling work for the operating water supply equipment is completed. Clean and check each part, and if necessary, replace parts. Next work is the assembling of the operating water supply equipment. The assembling will be conducted in the reverse order of the dismantling procedures. Set a sheet packing on the distributing nozzle. Make sure that the O-ring set inside the operating water disc is not twisted, and apply lubricating oil to it. Put the operating water disc into the water chamber and install it on the distributing nozzle. When incorporating the operating water disc retainer, screw it temporarily and confirm that the operating water disc completely touches the packing of the distributing nozzle. After that, remove the operating water disc retainer again, put in the locking washer and incorporate again the operating water disc retainer. When tightening the operating water disc retainer, set it carefully in position so that the tooth of the locking washer is set in the operating water disc retainer, and bend the tooth. Finally, place the water chamber cover and set 6 tongued washers and 6 bolts. Tighten them with a box driver and set the teeth of 6 tongued washers. This completes the assembling procedures for the operating water supply equipment. Next, the dismantling and assembling of the vertical shaft. First, set the vertical shaft on the vise and tap the upper bearing housing lightly and carefully with a plastic hammer and remove the upper bearing housing. Screw evenly 3 square-headed set screws into holes made in the bottom bearing case and pull out the bottom bearing case. Raise the tooth of the washer and loosen the shaft nut with a hook spanner and remove it. Apply a jack to the lower bearing cover and pull out the ball bearing and the angular contact ball bearing together. The ball bearing is removable just as it is incorporated in the lower bearing housing, so remove it by using a caulking chisel. Next, draw out the upper bearing. First, remove the washer and the shaft nut. Taking care not to damage the vertical shaft, tap the bearing inner race with a caulking chisel and take off the bearing. This completes the dismantling work for the vertical shaft. After cleaning and checking each part, start assembling the vertical shaft. The bearing will be incorporated into the vertical shaft by the shrink-fit method. Therefore, after inserting the bearing into the lower bearing inner case, put it in the heated oil. At this time, the bearing of the horizontal shaft is heated up together in the oil. The optimum oil temperature is about 100 degrees centigrade. After confirming that both bearings have been heated, set the vertical shaft on the vise, put in the lower bearing cover, and then incorporate the bearing inserted in the lower bearing inner case. Next, put in the collar and insert the angular contact ball bearing, paying attention not to insert the angular contact bearing upside down. If inserting it is difficult, tap the bearing inner race lightly with a caulking chisel. After a while, reset the vertical shaft upside down on the vise and insert the upper bearing. After confirming that the bearing has been cooled, tap the bearing inner race lightly with a caulking chisel. Confirm that the bearing has been set completely in position and then put in a washer and the shaft nut and tighten them. Then bend the tooth of the washer. Tap the upper bearing inner case with a plastic hammer evenly and set it into the upper bearing. Next, set the vertical shaft again on the vise, tap the angular contact bearing inner race lightly with a caulking chisel, and confirm that both bearings have properly been set. And then put in the washer and the shaft nut and tighten them. Then bend the tooth of the washer. Tap the bottom bearing case with a plastic hammer and fit it into the angular bearing. At this time, be sure to put together the bottom bearing case and the lower bearing inner case. That is the end of the assembling work for the vertical shaft. Next, dismantle and assemble the upper bearing housing. First, loosen the 6 upper spring retainers with a spanner. And then take out the upper springs and the spring receivers. Lastly, remove the upper bearing receiver. This completes the dismantling work for the upper bearing housing. Clean and check each part and, if necessary, replace parts by new ones. At this time, do not forget to measure the upper springs. After that, let's start assembling work. Set the upper bearing receiver correctly and put in the spring receivers, the springs and the spring retainers. And tighten them up evenly with a spanner. That ends the assembling work for the upper bearing housing. Next work is the dismantling and assembling of the horizontal shaft. First, put the friction pulley on the work table. Set the horizontal shaft on the vise and remove the spiral gear. Remove the 4 bolts fixing the spiral gear on the gear boss. Tap the spiral gear from the underside with a plastic hammer and remove it upward. Next, set the horizontal shaft on the vise. Raise the tooth of the washer and loosen the shaft nut with a hook spanner and remove it. Apply a jack for the bottom bearing to draw out the ball bearings. At this time, set a covering plate on the safety joint receiver provided at the end of the horizontal shaft so as not to widen the safety joint receiver. Go on tightening the handle of the jack and draw out the ball bearings. Remove the bearing case cover of the horizontal shaft. Remove the snap ring by using a ring spanner. Next, remove the washer and the shaft nut. Reset the horizontal shaft on the vise. Then remove the key installed on the side of the friction pulley and pull out the collar. Remove the horizontal shaft from the vise. Hold the gearbox with a pipe and place a wooden plate on the safety joint receiver side and tap it with a hammer and remove the gearbox. Set the horizontal shaft again on the vise and draw out the ball bearing on the side of the motor. Tap the ball bearing inner race with a caulking chisel with care not to damage the horizontal shaft and draw it out. That is the end of the dismantling work for the horizontal shaft. After cleaning and checking each part, start assembling work. First, install the gearbox on the horizontal shaft. Set the gearbox on the pipe and apply lubricating oil to the parts receiving the horizontal shaft. Fit the key and drive it into the horizontal shaft from the pulley side. At this time, also place a wooden plate on the shaft. After confirming that the gearbox has properly been installed, set the horizontal shaft on the vise, put in the washer and the shaft nut, tighten them, and bend the tooth of the washer. Reset the horizontal shaft on the vise and install the ball bearing which has been heated up on the shaft. Set the horizontal shaft in the former position again and install the snap ring with the ring spanner, bearing case cover, and then the ball bearing. In case it is difficult to install the bearing, tap it lightly with a caulking chisel in the same manner as in the case of the vertical shaft. When the bearing has been cooled, tap the bearing inner race lightly with a caulking chisel, and after confirming its position on the horizontal shaft, tighten the washer and the shaft nut and bend the tooth of the washer. Confirm that the bearing on the side of the pulley has properly been set. Install the collar on the horizontal shaft and set the key in the slot provided on the shaft by tapping it with a hammer. After setting the key, insert the horizontal shaft into the friction pulley. After confirming that the shaft can be drawn out smoothly from the pulley, install the spiral gear on the gear boss. This completes the assembling work for the horizontal shaft. Next, dismantle and assemble the gear pump. First, remove the safety joint and its holder by taking off the split cotter pin. Then, remove the cap nut of the relief valve. After confirming the position of the adjusting screw, loosen the lock nut. Remove the adjusting screw, the spring for the relief valve, and the valve stem. Loosen the 8 socket cap screws fixing the pump cover with a hexagon key. Tap the pump cover lightly with a hammer and remove it. Draw out the main pump gear and the follower pump gear. Sometimes 2 gear bushes may be drawn out together with the gear shafts. Draw out 4 gear bushes from the pump cover and the pump body. That is the end of the dismantling work for the gear pump. Clean and check each part and then start the assembling work. Set 2 gear bushes in the pump body. Next, incorporate the main pump gear and the follower pump gear. When incorporating the main pump gear, be careful not to damage the oil seal. Set the other two gear bushes in the pump cover, put the sheet packing on the cover and place the cover on the pump body. Go on tightening the 8 socket cap screws diagonally. Set the safety joint holder on the safety joint and insert the split cotter pin. Next, put the valve stem, the spring for the relief valve, and the adjusting screw in the pump cover. At this time, be sure to set the adjusting screw in the same position as before. If this screw goes too far, the operating pressure will become too high and the overloading will result. On the contrary, if the adjusting screw does not reach the former position, a shortage of intaking oil will arise. The optimum pressure of the gear pump is set at 4 kilograms per square centimeter. Install the sheet packing on the adjusting screw, tighten the lock nut and then the cap nut. This completes the assembling work for the gear pump. Now we have completed the dismantling and assembling work for all the components drawn out from the purifier frame. Now we will explain about the procedures of incorporating the following components into the frame. First, insert the vertical shaft. If we insert the horizontal shaft first, the vertical shaft cannot be set because the spiral gear hits the bottom bearing case. First, put 2 steel balls in the lower spring receivers and introduce the lower spring into the lower bearing housing and incorporate the set of lower spring receivers and steel balls into the lower bearing housing. Insert the vertical shaft into the lower bearing housing. Set the sheet packing on the upper bearing housing. Fit the key of the upper bearing receiver in the groove of the upper bearing inner case. At this time, match the bolt hole of the upper bearing housing with that of the frame and fix the upper bearing housing. Put the plate for the upper bearing correctly and then introduce our U-type packing into the upper bearing inner case. Set the sheet packing on the upper bearing housing cover and tighten 3 bolts evenly and fix the upper bearing housing cover. Put the upper cover. Next, the operating water supply equipment is incorporated. First, install the operating water supply equipment on the vertical shaft and set the cap nut of the copper tube. Tighten 3 socket cap screws and then the cap nut of the copper tube. Then, fix the operating water supply equipment to the vertical shaft by setting 2 square-headed set screws through the water chamber cover to the vertical shaft, and set the locking plate. Install the bowl bush on the vertical shaft. This completes incorporating all the parts related to the vertical shaft. Now we begin incorporating the horizontal shaft. Introduce the horizontal shaft into the frame carefully so as not to damage the oil seal set in the motor side bearing case. Loosen the 2 push bolts of the pump side bearing case and put back their heads to the former level. Set the sheet packing on the pump side bearing case and incorporate the pump side bearing case carefully into the horizontal shaft so as not to damage the oil seal, with the hole for bearing lubricating oil turned upward. After tightening all 6 bolts of the pump side bearing case, put 4 bolts into the holes of the bearing case cover and tighten them up. Next, the friction pulley is installed. Incorporate the pulley into the shaft by fitting the key of the horizontal shaft into the groove of the friction pulley. At this time, confirm that the friction pulley touches the horizontal shaft collar. Put in the washer and the shaft nut and tighten them with a pin spanner and bend the tooth of the washer. Fit the friction blocks to the friction boss set in the motor shaft by holding the blocks with the rubber band. In doing this, take care so that the friction blocks are fitted into the slots of the friction boss in the correct direction. Lift up the motor with a chain hoist and install it in the frame. Tighten the 4 bolts of the motor flange. Connect the motor wiring. Screw the frame plug, supply the prescribed amount of lubricating oil, and install the gear cover. Finally, install the gear pump. Set the safety joint into its receiver properly. Then, insert the set bolts of the gear pump and tighten them with a spanner. Put in the sheet packing. Connect the pump inlet and outlet pipes with the gear pump and tighten the cap nut firmly. Install the bowl and the trap. Confirm the rotating direction of the motor and then start operation. And this completes all the dismantling and assembling procedures for the parts related to the main body of the Mitsubishi self-ejector.